Thanks. So great pleasure to be here, and it's amazing. So I was in Pompeian in May, and it sounds like even since then there have been new discoveries. So it's very difficult to follow something like Sophie's talk. So I'm going to give you some insights into something that was discovered a few years ago, so not quite as hot off the press. And given that I have an obsession with Latin inscriptions, it's inevitably going to be a detailed analysis of just one inscription, but you'll see why this is worth it, hopefully, by the end. So in 2017, a monumental tomb outside the Stabian Gate was re-excavated, and this is K on the map here, during renovation work on a 19th century building, which had been partly built on top of this structure. It contained the longest known inscription on a tomb at Pompeii, some 4 meters long and containing 183 words. And this one inscription gives us new insights into Pompeian culture, society and politics over the last 50 years or so of the town's existence. So if you're familiar with Pompeii, just to lead you downhill from the area of the theatres, just beyond the Stabian Gate itself and the town walls, where there's a group of impressive public tombs. Immediately outside the gate on the left, we find 2 semicircular tombs of tufa found in 1874 and 1889. These have been dated to the Augustan period on the basis of typology. So-called seat tomb, very distinctive for honours for public benefactors. The most famous one of these is for the priestess Mamia outside the Herculaneum Gate. The first one, which you see here on the left, has no epitaph preserved on it, but the boundary stones, which do have inscriptions, show that the tomb was for Marcus Tullius by decree of the town councillors. He had a private house just to the north of the Forum and had founded the Temple of Fortuna Augusta next door to his house in AD 3. The other tomb does have an epitaph, and this belongs to Marcus Aelius Minius, but we actually know nothing about him other than what this epitaph says. This reveals he had served as joint chief magistrate with judicial authority, and that the burial plot was given to him at public expense in accordance with a decree of the town councillors. Now, initially, when you visit this little area just outside the Stabian Gate, it looks like it's less densely packed with tombs than the better known street of the tombs outside the Herculaneum Gate. But this is a misleading impression, because other tombs had been excavated and then reburied in that area in the late 19th century. And it's these additional tombs that are now beginning to re-emerge. So further on beyond the gate, in 2001 to 2, the core podia of 2 tombs came to light. They probably originally supported a funerary altar on top, and inside there were burial chambers with the remains of cinerary urns. They're unusual in actually being in the road rather than to one side or the other. Now, the tomb we're going to look at for the rest of the talk is just a few meters beyond these tombs, revealed underneath a 19th century building. So it was already damaged by this earlier work. In the 19th century, it was partly excavated, and then this other building was put on top of it. So what we've got is just the bottom part of the tomb, which consists of a curving structure in marble, but the actual tomb chamber above it is no longer preserved. Its funerary inscription gives fascinating insights into 1st century AD society, culture and politics at Pompeii. So it has this very lengthy inscription on the west side. Interestingly, this is not the main dedicatory inscription, because frustratingly it doesn't actually record the name of the deceased. And it starts with the phrase, "This man, Hick." So obviously, the bit that we're missing would actually tell us who it is. So what's particularly interesting is it's not an epitaph as such, but it is a miniature raised gestae, which of course links up brilliantly with my other main bit of research on Augustus's raised gestae. And whether consciously or not, it does have a striking verbal and thematic resonance to Augustus's own raised gestae. It's also similar structurally in combining both chronological and thematic ordering of the activities described. It's possibly an abbreviated version of the funeral eulogy delivered in his honour. It has rhetorical features, and it also feels slightly disjointed, as we'll see in a moment, and very episodic. So it does feel like this is a random set of excerpts from a much longer text. It records the benefactions by an individual to Pompey, including gladiatorial shows, a banquet, cash distribution, and handouts of bread and grain. This inscription is exceptional for its scale and for the combination of gifts it describes. The lettering, as you can see, is clearly cut, but it's still possible to come up with different interpretations of how to translate it. Some words seem just to have been omitted, and others are abbreviated. So I hope you'll agree it's worth the time going through it in detail to set it into context and to reflect upon the new insights it offers us. So it begins, as I've already said, with hic, this man. But despite the elegance of its carving, we have two words missing in the very first sentence, supplied here within angled brackets. So he starts by describing a banquet which he had given on the assumption of his adult toga. So the coming of age ceremony, usually for boys aged 14 or 15. And this possibly dates to around the AD 30s, so the Tiberian era. So it looks like it starts the account of his raised gestae, if I can call it that, with his earliest example of public generosity. We have a roughly contemporary parallel from the same region. So from Sorrento, just down the road on the Circa Vesuviana, we have, again from the Tiberian period, a flamen, a priest of Rome and Tiberius, Lucius Cornelius, something, the name's missing, who made a handout of foodstuffs to the populace of Sorrentum to mark his assumption of the toga virilis, followed by then giving later on gladiatorial and circus games when holding magistracies, a banquet for town councillors to mark the high point of his career in public life as quinquennalis. And it ends by recording the fact he's been given a public burial and a statue from public funds. The reason why this is such a useful parallel is that it helps to pinpoint how the Pompeian example far exceeds the donations given at Sorrento. So as you'll see, the wording is interesting. At Pompeii, we have a description of a banquet, an epulum, not just mere honeyed wine and cake. Or perhaps, in the context of the general election, I quite like this point, perhaps, in fact, it was wine and cake, but it was being called an epulum in order to make it sound more extravagant. Both occasions at Pompeii and at Sorrento were targeted at the town's populace. So in effect, they were both on a similar scale for their communities. But the new inscription makes its feast sound more impressive by specifying 456 couches with 15 individuals reclining per couch. So with a quick bit of maths, we end up with 6,840 diners. These details raise more questions than they answer. Where could this number of couches be set out? Was it one location in the town? Was it multiple locations? Obviously it's not in someone's private house, so this feast must have had the approval of the town council. Perhaps it was in the large palaestra, perhaps it was in the amphitheatre, in the forum, in the triangular forum. We just don't know, but all of these might be possible. Was it necessary to construct special couches to cater for the 5 diners reclining on each? where could the food be cooked, the text doesn't mention the large-scale labour activity needed behind the scenes, presumably many, many slaves needed to cook and to serve the food. So it gives an unusual insight into the potential size of an individual slave household in Pompeii if all these slaves belong to the family of the benefactor. So perhaps we need to adjust our assumptions that even the wealthiest Pompeian household included just a handful of slaves. Or was this a collaborative effort? Or were several bakeries employed in producing the thousands of cakes needed? And later on in the inscription, we actually find the same honorand could produce significant quantities of loaves of bread. So he's clearly got a hotline, if I can put it that way, to a bakery. It's not clear how to interpret the total of 6,840 diners, who are described both as the populace and as homines. They could represent adult male citizens of Pompeii, but perhaps we can't exclude the possibility that the word homines included women as well as men. It's unlikely that children were included, since the whole point of the feast is to celebrate the moment at which the honorand took up his toga virilis, and thus the practice of reclining to dine. If the 6,840 diners were the adult male citizen population living within Pompeii, who arguably made up no more than a third of the total population, estimates of Pompeii's overall population, as in the region of 7,500 to 15,000, would then seem far too low. We would possibly be looking instead at between 20,000 and 25,000. But were these citizens those who lived only in the urban area of Pompeii, or did individuals come into the town from the surrounding areas, from the rural areas, to participate? The question of whether those invited to the banquet included individuals from Pompeii's territory beyond the town remains unanswered, and that would make all the difference to our calculations of the population. So would the addition into Pompeii's total population of non-citizen foreigners. What's clear, though, is the substantial amount of money being invested in this rite of passage. If we consider the cost of the banquet to be in the region of 2 denarii or 8 sesterces per head, the honorand might have paid out somewhere in the region of 13,680 denarii or 54,720 sesterces. At the end of this first sentence, we have an ivy leaf on the inscription, which is unusual in Pompeii, and it seems to act as a sort of thematic separation mark, with the following sentence then turning to events unconnected with the assumption of the toga virilis. So we then move on to his presentation of a gladiatorial show. He doesn't actually say how many gladiators fought, but he does claim that his games were exceptionally lavish, and he mentions the figure of 416 gladiators. Now, the painted inscriptions for gladiatorial shows in Pompeii show that the maximum number of pairs of gladiators known to have performed at games in Pompeii is a mere 35 pairs. At Puteoli, much more impressive town around the bay, we have as many as 49 pairs. It's only when we turn to somewhere like Rome that we get an altogether different scale, for example with 5,000 pairs of gladiators performing under Trajan for 4 months to celebrate his Dacian triumph. So 416 gladiators certainly sounds like a large number to be in his training school, and that would be roughly a quarter of the number in the Ludus Magnus at Rome, for instance. So what I think we have here is our Pompeian benefactor. He's not trying to rival the emperor, he's not trying to outdo the kinds of shows you get in Rome, but he is trying to say that his games are exceptional for a colony. And this fits well into the impression of rivalry, notably with neighbouring Nuceria, that emerges at Pompeii from other evidence. Moving on, he then talks about his intervention at a time of food shortage in distributing both grain and baked bread. Now, it might appear unexpected for there to be a food shortage at Pompeii, given the Vesuvian region's fame for agricultural productivity. But it seems likely that Pompeii was in fact dependent to some degree upon imported grain, because a lot of the surrounding area was devoted to wine growing because viticulture was more profitable than growing grain. But it's unclear exactly what's being claimed here. So, for instance, the word eos in the Latin could refer to the gladiators of the previous sentence, or it could be looking forward to the reference to the keyways that comes afterwards. It does seem rather mind-boggling if he is claiming that he solved the subsistence of the entire citizen body of Pompeii for 4 years. But he describes how there had been a cost of living crisis in the town, with a measure of grain shooting up to cost 20 sesterces rather than the more usual 3 to 7.5 sesterces. So he then stepped in to sell the grain at a subsidised price, with the subsidy, as described here, worth some 95,769 sesterces. But he says that even then not everyone could afford to buy the grain, so he even distributed free loaves of bread. Now, this inscription perhaps helps to go some way in helping us to interpret a long-known painting from Pompeii, initially known after it was found as a fresco of a baker from the Duplinum of House 7330 to the northeast of the Forum, which was a relatively small atrium house. It's much more likely, in fact, to be the sort of scenario we're dealing with in the inscription, the distribution of free bread to the citizenry of Pompeii, rather than a commercial transaction. So could this possibly actually be the historical episode mentioned in the tomb? We know from the famous riot in the amphitheatre painting at Pompeii that Pompeian painters could turn their hands on occasion to depicting real-life scenarios in Pompeii. So it's tempting to suggest that this too is a representation of a real-life event. But there's also an individual called Gaius Julius Polybius, who is praised in his electoral campaign for providing good bread to the people of Pompeii. So it may be that this is not actually our deceased handing out his loaves of bread, it could be a rival. The next benefaction of another gladiatorial show is described as occurring before the senatorial decree, and this seems to be linked to the senatorial decree passed after the riot in 59, depicted in the previous slide, after which the Senate banned further gladiatorial shows as described by Tacitus in Annals 14. The Luciones described here are the preliminary gladiatorial bouts which happened as a means of choosing the pairings for the actual games, and they also served as an advertisement for the main event over several days. The next sentence then relates to a privilege being granted by Caesar. This is usually taken to be referring to the situation in the wake of the riot, when gladiatorial combats were forbidden in Pompeii. It seems that our deceased honorand appealed directly to the Emperor Nero, who then allowed him to bring his troop of gladiators back to Pompeii. The choice of words is interesting here. Nero is not being mentioned by name, he's just referred to as Caesar, and this is perhaps reflecting a reluctance to name him in the wake of his suicide and downfall in the decade afterwards. But it might be worth considering another interpretation of this reference here. Another way of looking at it might be that this is referring to the time of grain shortage, and that perhaps as we know happened on occasion, the emperor steps in to banish gladiators from Rome and a 200-mile radius from Rome in order to focus the food supply on the citizen population of Rome and Italy. But on one reading of this inscription, perhaps it's telling us that because the deceased was willing to fund the food supply for his gladiator familiar himself, and also to subsidise the grain supply and the free bread for the rest of the inhabitants of Pompeii, perhaps this is another way of interpreting this part of the inscription. It depends on how we interpret the structure of the inscription. It's not guaranteed, I think, that the privilege granted by Caesar, to which this alludes, it doesn't necessarily relate to the previous sentence about the senatorial decree. It could be, as I say, a sign of editing and exerting. He goes on then to describe his distribution of cash to different parts of society, to the town councillors, to the Augustales, to the Pagani, who are perhaps office holders of the Pagi or country districts around Pompeii. Perhaps, again, this is debated translation, it could be that also the people of Pompeii received a handout of money as well. The final bit then talks about two final sets of shows of ludi, and the use of the word ludi here instead of munus fits with the idea that these were the games held in connection with being a magistrate of Pompeii, whereas the munera mentioned earlier were unrelated, they were just private acts of munificence. Now, magistrates of Pompeii were expected to subsidise jointly with the res publica such games with support from public funding, but here it's claimed that instead he met the costs entirely himself. The inscription as preserved ends with the proposal to elect him as a town patron, and it starts with the people making this demand, perhaps via acclamation in the amphitheatre, and it's particularly befitting perhaps the idea that the arena might have been the area where the people rose up and acclaimed him, exactly where they benefited from so many exciting gladiatorial combats which he paid for. It then describes consensus among the town councillors, but then has an unexpected twist and says he turned down the chance to become the town's patron, saying that he didn't want to patronise his fellow citizens. So the Latin has that pejorative meaning as well as its positive meaning, potentially. As I mentioned at the start, the tomb was originally discovered in 1844, and at around the same time, a large relief over 4 metres wide and 1.5 metres high was also discovered. It's now on display in Naples Museum, and some people have identified this relief as belonging to our tomb. It depicts a procession followed by gladiatorial combat, followed by witch hunts. And it is tempting to link to the tomb, but the link must remain at least debatable, given the lack of clarity about the find spot. It's just found somewhere roughly in the area of the Stabian Gate, but for instance, it could have been found nearer to the gladiatorial barracks behind the theatre, and more fundamentally, it's also unclear even whether it was found in its original location or in a reused context. So I've sort of been teasing you about, well, who is this individual whose name is not preserved? Well, one possibility that seems certainly very plausible is Gnaeus Alaeus Nigidius Maius, who was a prominent local magistrate in Pompeii. He came to prominence under Nero, so we know from one of the wax tablets of Pompeii that he served as quinquennalis in 55 to 56. Originally a Nigidius, he was adopted by the Alei, and his mother, Pomponia Decarchus, was buried in the tomb of Eumachia, suggesting that he belonged to a well-connected family. His daughter Alea had been a public priestess of Ceres and Venus, and was also honoured after her death by the town councillors. Several painted inscriptions relate to the lavish games which he gave on several occasions. He's hailed as Princeps Munerariorum, a leading games giver. 2 painted notices advertised games whilst he was quinquennalis, with 20 pairs and then 30 pairs of gladiators. Now, it's previously been suggested that this actually alludes to a single set of games, but perhaps these are precisely the ludi mentioned in our inscription as given twice without expense to the town, and perhaps, in fact, what we've got is the exceptional character of his munificence is that he actually gave 2 lots of games when he was quinquennalis, and that he paid for it entirely out of his own funds. We also have a games advert in large red lettering outside the main entrance to the gladiatorial barracks on the external wall of the large theatre, dating from the Flavian era. So this shows that he also continued to put on gladiatorial shows even after his political career under Nero. So I would say it seems quite reasonable to hail him as the leading games giver in Pompeii. Now, if the inscription outside the Stabian Gate does relate to Nigidius Maius, its themes and language could reflect another title given to him, and one other Pompeian, of Princeps Polonii. You can see that. The themes of the inscription echo typical acts of imperial generosity, most famously as outlined by Augustus in the Res Gestae. So notably, benefactions in terms of cash distributions, games, and especially the alleviation of food shortage. And there are several phrases and rhetorical techniques that this inscription shares with the Res Gestae. Both use statistics for impressive effect. At Pompeii, mentioning 456 triclinia and 416 pairs of gladiators, which help to create a sense of the exceptional benefaction that recalls Augustus's manipulation of statistics for similar effect. The style and wording of the claim about putting on gladiatorial shows, complete with impressive statistics, recalls Augustus's claims in the Res Gestae. The choice of verbs mirrors the Res Gestae, giving him sole responsibility. The reference to alleviating a public food shortage recalls similar claims by Augustus in the Res Gestae. And other aspects of the Pompeian text also emphasize the theme more commonly found in imperial ideology of the consensus among all levels of society in praising the deceased. The most striking example of this parallelism comes right at the end, in describing his refusal to become town patron, which of course slots neatly into the imperial tradition of turning down offices. The Pompeian rejection of public office, however, uses the verb intercacit, a verb redolent of the power of veto exercised by the tribunes in Rome, which is somewhat paradoxical when juxtaposed with the word privatus, and contrasts sharply with Augustus's quite different language in the Res Gestae, where he turns down posts such as an everlasting consulship, using much less uncompromising language. Now, I don't want to imply that the Pompeian text is somehow drawing directly on the Res Gestae as a model, but the language and the themes used show how a member of Pompeii's elite could be represented as behaving as a miniature emperor, which might even have led to him being granted the title of Princeps Colonii. So to sum up, the new inscription reveals the role of one local politician over several decades. Frustratingly, it both promises to solve one of the major questions about the nature of Pompeii's society and economy, its population size, but in the end serves simply to add another layer of complexity to existing debates. It illustrates how one individual acted as public benefactor on 7 different occasions over several decades, subsidising food supply, giving out free bread and handouts of cash, putting on lavish gladiatorial games, both as a private individual and in his capacity as magistrate. We see the desire to benefit the whole community of Pompeii. The inscription is unusual in its tone, and it does seem likely that it was excerpted from the eulogy given at his funeral. Whether or not the benefactor is Aulus Nugidius Maius, whoever he is, projects an image of his role in Pompeii as imitating the role of the princeps in Rome in terms of the types of benefaction given, but even more intriguingly, in the language used to describe the benefactions. He has a desire to represent himself too as a favoured individual with the ear of the emperor. It helps to illustrate how by the mid-1st century AD, the towns of Italy had thoroughly assimilated the imperial ideology and how local elites wanted to associate themselves with Rome as a means of boosting their own status locally. So I would like to argue that the inscription illustrates the type of career that might have ended up in an individual being hailed as the princeps of Pompeii.